We are going to continue from Perek Beis Pasuk Kaf Hey and Perek Gimel Pasuk Zayin, because last time we dealt with the psukim in between the two, which was the actual sin. So just to review, in Perek Beis Pasuk Kaf Hey, the last verse in Perek Beis, it's reported that Adam and Chava were naked and they were not ashamed. Then comes the whole episode with the snake. And then at the end of that episode comes the statement, the eyes of both of them were open. They realized that they were naked. Then they sewed together the fig leaves and made themselves aprons. So last time we discussed what went on there. So just to quickly review, man is placed to emulate, to be like Hashem, to think like Hashem. This was testing the being like Hashem part. Adam and Chava were dedicated to studying the trees, studying the world around them, to learn about Hashem. There was one tree that was off limits to them. The snake, representing the evil inclination, tempts them to eat from it with the most difficult lure, which is the line that if you eat from this, you will be like God, knowing good and bad. And in so much as the entire goal is to be like God, what could be better than that? And what this evil inclination meant would be is that you could truly, truly be the creators of your own destiny, because you could overcome the evil from within, which made perfect sense, except that Hashem said not to do that. And then we focused on the idea that the ultimate service of God is when you sacrifice yourself and what you perceive to be the best way to serve God in lieu of actually what God tells you is the best way to serve God. And that becomes the transgression. That becomes symbolic of all future major transgressions. And that's what knocks Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, off of their pedestal. And the way the Torah brackets this, so to speak, is before this happened, they were naked and not ashamed. And after it happened, they were naked. They realized they were naked. They were ashamed, and they made a fig leaf apron. So right now, our goal is to discuss how nakedness plays a role here and what went on. Right, so we're going to use the following assumption. Okay, let's start with what we know to be true. Man is a synthesis between body and soul. The assumption is going to be as follows. Man, before the sin, the soul was so powerful, or the body was so weak, one or the other, or both, it could be either one, that if you looked at a human body, you would not see the body, you'd see the silhouette of the body, and it would be glowing. You would see the glow of the soul emanating from the body. So that if you look at an elephant, it would look the same as an elephant looks like today. But if you look at a human being, you would not see what we would see if you looked in the mirror while you were taking a shower or something, whatever. You would see that as a silhouette. There would be arms, there'd be legs, right? It's still a human, but you'd see a glow come out. And it was unmistakable that you were looking at a spiritual being. There would be no way to confuse man with an animal. To put it in a very modern sense, no scientist would ever look at this and say, this and this have anything to do with each other, because this is glowing and this is a coarse physical body. When Adam and Eve looked at each other prior to the sin, the reason why they were naked but not embarrassed is because they didn't see themselves as a physical body. They saw each other's soul bursting out. Well, when one sees a soul staring at them, the thoughts that run through the head are not the thoughts of physical pleasure that would come from seeing a naked body, because you're not perceiving a naked body, you're perceiving a glowing soul. Therefore, there was no shame in being naked. On the contrary, they didn't see themselves as naked, they saw themselves as the highest being on planet Earth. Every animal around them looked like an animal. They looked like humans. They were glowing. Now, it's a dispute if it's one of these semantics for the most part. When they sinned, did the soul get diminished or does the body get coarser? I'm sure it matters in deep thought, but the upshot of it is when you look at a human being now, you don't see the glow. A human being from the outside looks like an animal looks, just that he looks like a person. A rabbit looks like a rabbit, and a horse looks like a horse, and a human looks like a human. But they all look, you don't see the soul, okay? Except in one person, and this is how we know of this truism, because although I've used this to explain why they weren't ashamed, but the Torah clues us in to the reality of this, because the one person in the entire story of the Torah who achieves the highest level of purification of his essence, the person who achieves the closest connection to Hashem, the person who achieves the greatest level of spirituality was Moshe Rabbeinu, after spending the 40 days on the mountain, where he literally had as close or as intimate as a connection to God as any person since Adam. And we know that when Moses came down from the mountain, his face was glowing, because the idea was that he had achieved a semblance of what Adam and Eve were prior to the sin, so that although his body still was masking the glow, his face actually allowed the soul to come out, and you could actually perceive the soul in Moshe's face. That's what the Torah is describing by the radiance of the face. And in fact, when Moshe was born, the Medrash says that already he had a little glow to his face. But they say in the Svarim that get into the thought and the depth of the Hebrew language and the like. So it's a fascinating thing. In English and in most other languages that I'm aware of, so when you talk about a face, you're always talking about the external, like from the word facade of a building, or right? But in Hebrew, the word face is panim. Now, some learn panim comes from the word poneh, which means to turn, and that's because we turn our face. Okay, that won't work with this. But alternatively, the word in Hebrew to enter, to go inside, is bifnim, bipanim, into the face. Bifnim in Hebrew means to go inward. So it would come out that according to that approach, the face in Hebrew is referred to not as the facade of a person, the external, but is actually referred to as the window to the inside. And it's spoken that although the arms, legs, and every other part of a human would look similar to the corresponding part of an animal, right? I mean, obviously more so to a monkey or to a horse than to a mouse or something, but there's still some, but the human face is already totally different. The whole shape of the face, the whole appearance of the face it's specifically, they talk about the eyes, but but the whole face is unique. There's nothing like it in a human face. And they explain that it's because when the soul lessened or the body coarsened, or both, whichever, right? The face left was the one thing that wasn't affected as much, so that you can still see into the soul by way of the human face. If you look at a human stomach, a human back, a human elbow, a human arm, you will not see anything of the soul. To put it in a different sense, you could look at the greatest, most righteous, holiest person, and his elbow is just going to look like an elbow. That's just the way it is. But if you take a holy person and you look at their face and you can have some perception, or you look at a wicked person, and the Talmud says you shouldn't stare at the face of a wicked person. And the reason is because when you look at the face, you're getting some insight into the essence of the person. So if you look at a wicked person, you're staring at the essence of wickedness. If you look at the elbow of a wicked person, it's just an elbow.
We say the body's divided up into three things, or human is divided up into three things. One, you have the soul, which starts out pure.
Right.
The baby is pure.
Okay.
Then you have the body, which is the pathway for the alHaTorah.
Okay. Yeah.
And then you got the brain, because God gave us
so the
power to.
So the brain is interfacing with the soul. So
and the body.
And into the body, right? So the
right. So the brain, but God gave us the power to choose.
Right.
Okay. So the brain has the power to choose. So the body works negatively,
or
the soul works positively,
and then the overall. Correct. And the body is naturally working against the soul just by its very nature.
Correct.
And then the evil inclination is the external, now to become internal voice in the head, which is playing off of the body, but it's not the body. It's a spiritual entity above and beyond the natural coarseness of or non-spirit of the body, just by being a body. But the point here is that the face then becomes the place where you could still have some semblance to the soul. I believe that, and I suppose that you could give your own interpretation, and if you don't buy into this, then what I'm going to say can be explained otherwise. But if you do buy into it, you will appreciate this as a truth, is that little children, the reason why they universally appear to be cute and tender and the like, whether they are Jewish and to a degree even Gentile, children are children. There's something when you look at a kid, because they don't have sin to soil their soul. So you still are seeing a certain innocence that is coming out through their face. That is unique. Now that's going to change as they mature and as they become adults. But the face becomes that window into. So that's the idea here. If you're Moses, though, you can get to the point where you literally start glowing again. But that's how it was for them. So once they sinned and they changed the course of history, because what they were supposed to do was overcome this, and then they would have perfected their knowledge of Hashem, then they could have worked on their interpersonal relationship, they would have had their children, created a community, and then ultimately, transcended, and all life would be like it will be in the future, where we are basking in the glory of Hashem, and we earned it, and it would have been right. But everything went very south at this point, because instead of elevating everything, they destroyed everything. And now everything becomes so much more difficult, because now not only is the spiritual force that we're overcoming external, it's now internal. And now, instead of looking at each other as souls, we now look at each other as a body. And immediately, Adam and Chava, now we fast forward to the end parenthesis, so to speak, which is verse 7. The eyes are open, it's figurative, obviously, and they realize they're naked. All of a sudden, Adam is looking at Eve, and she's no longer glowing. She's now a beautiful woman in the physical sense. And now Chava is looking at man, and he's now a man, right? Not a glowing thing. And now all of a sudden, that sense, which is built into the human psyche, it's actually built into every animal, the natural, what's called it's not only is it the cleanest way to describe it, it's actually the most accurate way of describing it. It's the mating urge. Okay, now there's a bunch of different names in secular terminology, but the truest sense is every creature has a built-in urge to procreate because God told every creature to procreate. Now, man and woman, had they been soul, would have approached each other, although they looked at souls, they would have done this as the way that it's described is they would have done it as any other duty, any other command, like eating and drinking and, relieving oneself, and they would have lived together and it just would have been part of, but it wouldn't have come with all the mental and the physical baggage and all this other thing that goes into the relationship. That it would have been looked at as just a normal part. It would be no different than eating or drinking or anything else. But now that the soul was repressed, so to speak, now they looked at each other in a way where they sensed that there was some sort of drive that wasn't just the procreation urge, it was more than that. And this was something that was challenging their spirituality, meaning to do everything correctly is very spiritual and very proper and a fulfillment of God's will. But they sensed right away they weren't looking at each other as humans, they were looking at each other as animals. Now, their looking at each other as animals was a very high level, not like two people nowadays may look, or any people on the street or whatever, but that change, they saw an amazing change, which is, I'm not looking at a soul, I'm looking at a body, and they realized right away the implications. So they covered the aprons, they made aprons. Now, the Torah is very clean in its language. They just say they realized they were naked and they sewed aprons. Now, aprons, we know, are worn on the waist because they understood the only thing they needed to cover was the reproductive area, because that's what was driving primarily this animalistic thing, which is now a major challenge because it's a very holy activity and a holy union, which is part of God's plan, but it's now not being looked at like humans look at it. It's being looked at it like the horse and the dog look at it. They realize they have to cover that up because they have to keep that holy and special and not allow their physical side to get involved in this most physical activity. They have to keep it spiritual. So that is what that was intuitive to them. So they covered up their private areas, but everything else was uncovered because that much they were holy enough that did not take away. They were still able to look at each other as human beings. What's interesting, and we will come back to verse 8 in a moment, but we're going to fast forward just to end the clothing issue. So the clothing issue ends on verse 21. And it's a fascinating thing that sometimes goes overlooked because the way the Torah does the narrative is the minute that they recognize that they're naked and they cover up, so God speaks to them and says what's going on. But then God does something fascinating in verse 21. In verse 21, Hashem makes for Adam and his wife garments of skin and he clothes them. Now, it's important to get the Hebrew here because we're not going to be able to define a garment properly without the Hebrew word. So the Hebrew word is for the garment is kasnos. Okay, now we'll come back to that word very soon, but that's a very important word. Before we get to that word, let's understand something. Forget for a moment what the material of the clothing was, because that's a whole big discussion and nothing I want to get into. What I want to get into is, why did God feel the need to clothe them? They already clothed themselves. They put aprons on. But Hashem felt that that's not good enough. You have to cover yourself with kasnos. Okay, so kasnos, we know exactly what that means. because it's one of the garments that the Kohen wears. So therefore, we have a very good idea of exactly what God dressed them in. And I believe there's going to be a picture of it. If you turn to page 467, you are going to see a picture of what the kosnos, it's going to be the kisones, because it's in Havarat Ashkenazis. And there you're going to see what a kisones looks like on 467. And you are going to note that it covers, and what does it cover? Everything except for the hands, feet, and face. The feet is a machlokas rishonim, so let's take the feet out. Some say it went down to the floor, some say it went down to the ankle. So let's take the feet out. It doesn't cover the hand, and it doesn't cover the face, which means that Adam and Eve put aprons on, or what we would call undergarments, boxers or whatever. And God said, wait a second. That is not good enough. I want you to wear a total covering. And this actually underscores the laws of modesty and the concept behind modesty at a much deeper level. Adam and Eve were concerned of the laws of modesty. When they saw each other as physical entities that had this physical attraction to each other due to seeing each other's nakedness, they realized that a very holy thing was being compromised, and they needed to change the tone on that. So they covered up, and they felt that was good enough. And for them, it was good enough. But we understand from what they did is that any time the lack of coverage leads to a breakdown where one views the other gender in a physical way as it relates to intimacy, and it pulls away at the holiness in it, that needs to be shied away from. And the biology of it has it that a woman does not respond to a man the same way a man responds to a woman. So therefore, over time, it developed, as people were not as holy as Adam and Eve, that a woman had to cover up more of her body than the man as it related to modesty, as it related to stimulating the other gender to contemplate a more physical approach to procreation. But God is saying there's something much bigger than that. Now, it's not mandated in law the same way. What Adam and Eve did, it became normative halacha. Over time, the rabbis fine-tuned it, and they got very detailed over a certain part, whether it be the ankle or the knee, different opinions, whether it be the elbow, the bicep, the shoulder, different opinions, the neck, whatever that is, that became codified as law. And it happens to be, based on the biology, that's more relevant to the woman to the man than the man to the woman. But God's act is beyond that. God is saying, wait a second, you got to be totally covered, not just women, men also, because there's something more important than just trivializing the holiness of procreation and having the physical creep into something that should be spiritual. There is not knowing who you are. And you need to know you are not an animal. You need to know you are a soul. And the way the Meforshim explain this is that one of the greatest lies, and it's ironic because the Meforshim spoke this out long before science went in this direction. But one of the greatest lies is that a man is a sophisticated animal. A man has nothing to do with an animal. A man has a soul and an animal doesn't. They're both alive, but a man is, in Rashi's words, much more alive. It's like everyone, from Animal Farm, everyone's created equal. Some are just more equal than others. So every animal's alive. Plants are also alive. Man is a little more alive than everyone else because they have a soul. But if you look at a human being, you don't see that. because they look like an animal, but they only look like an animal on every part of their body except for their face. Their face still looks uniquely human. Says God to Adam and Eve, it's very nice what you did. You covered up your apron, you covered up your private areas. To you, that was enough to stem the physicalization of this holy act of reproduction. But for other people, that's not going to be enough. There'll have to be other rules. Men, women will be different. But I, as God, am telling you a moral imperative. You can never look at another human being as being an animal. Therefore, the only thing you should ever see of another person is the hand and the face. The face, because a face is uniquely human. You'll never mistake a human face for an animal face. And the hand is either, it's two approaches. One is it's just practical. You just need your hands free to be able to do stuff. So there's just limits to it. The ideal has limits, okay? The other is that the human hand is actually unique because of the thumbs. The thumb's actually, a human hand is different than all other animals. The human thumb is, I think, it bends in a different direction than all other animals, whatever. Look it up, that's what they say. But so some will say that the hands could be revealed just on a practical level, because man has to be able to use their hands. If they were covered, they couldn't do anything. It's like, I don't know, like changing a tire with your gloves on or something like that. It's just going to be hard to do. Or because really a human hand also is fundamentally different than an animal hand, and it has to do with the thumbs. But suffice it to say, God was saying, no, this is something much bigger than modesty in the sense of physical interaction. This is about you being a human being and not an animal. Every part of our body looks no different than the animal. You couldn't just, you show someone a dismembered leg, and if it's bloodied enough, you could confuse it for one animal. A leg's a leg, whatever. And definitely between a righteous person and a wicked person, there is no difference. These are all very coarse parts. The face is unique, therefore the face can be revealed, and the body should be totally covered. And that becomes the moral imperative, and that's why you'll find in many environments in which they are striving for higher levels of spirituality, there will be no difference between the men and the women in the level of coverage. Again, exactly what the dress is different. The women's dress shouldn't shape the body, therefore the skirt is preferable to pants, and yada yada. And that's why a dress or a looser fitting thing is better. And so you still have a little bit of the other. But the fact that everything should be covered is both to men and women, which is why in many places you won't find men wearing short sleeve shirts. It'll always be a long sleeve shirt. You won't find men wearing shorts. They don't make, to my knowledge, you won't find, like the Hasidic garden shorts version. It doesn't exist, because that part is not different, because a man and a woman are equally human. And therefore, really, everyone should be totally covered other than their face and their hands. I believe, incidentally, that if tznius was taught that way, meaning from God's point of view back to Adam's point of view, and not focused on the other way around, I think we'd do better in teaching tznius in general. But the facts are that one is mandated by halacha and one is an ideal. And that's where it seems we focus more on the letter of the law, and that drives our focus for good reason, because their non-compliance is violation, whereas here it would be not ideal, which is why there are laws in halacha, ideals that one should be undressed even when they're by themselves as little as possible and for as short a period as possible. Obviously, there's some things that require that, certain taking care of the body, but it should always be done as least as possible, because you should never see yourself, even yourself, let alone someone else, as being an animal, because we're humans. And we don't make that mistake if we focus on faces, because faces are human. When we start seeing body, that's when we get confused. And when you have a society that doesn't get dressed, It's not, so forget the Adam and Eve element of it. The God element of it is when you have a society that doesn't get dressed, they start thinking that they're sophisticated animals. They go hand in hand. You're a sophisticated animal, you start taking your clothes off. When you start taking your clothes off, you start thinking you're a sophisticated animal. And then it goes back and forth. And then, not to say this is a bad thing, because it's neither here nor there, it's everyone's personal preference, but just in the idea, people start clothing their animals now. Okay. Now, again, it's each their own. Everyone has their, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying it's good. But it's interesting that my guess is that as the line gets blurred between sophisticated and it's ironic that I would say no point in history, to my knowledge, maybe the Aborigines, but no civilized society, is it more acceptable to go out in public or to a dignified event. You go to a wedding and people are not dressed, whatever. And the animals, though, seem to get more and more clothing. And, that just seems to be an interesting thing. But it smacks at what God said, we don't want this to happen. So it's a fascinating thing that it tells us how to look at each other. And that's what changed between before the sin and after the sin. Now there was this risk that you would see each other as an animal, not a human. So therefore God said, it's good. It's important to cover up the private area. That's going to ultimately become halacha. But the ideal really is to be totally covered, other than the face, which is interesting because you never find in the whole Torah ever the face being covered, except two places. Moshe is one of them, because once the soul is coming out, then that was so abnormal, it freaked people out, and they couldn't deal with Moshe. And they saw Moshe as being so unique and different. He had to cover that up at certain points so they can interact with him. So that you find that it's ironic. The one place where the mask, so to speak, is used is to cover Moshe's face when it's glowing. So it's like the reverse. The other place is Rivka in last week's parsha. So it seems that someone would just explain it's modesty, but I think that I think this would be the nicer interpretation, is that when Rivka saw Yitzchak, there was such an outpouring of her spirit and this could be every woman on her wedding day, that there's such kedusha and such important things going on that it could be a little bit that people say the bride has a special look to it. Even the Talmud has we don't accept this as law, but there is an opinion in the Talmud that you're allowed to look. A man can stare at the Kala's face to make it more like, so that the husband thinks he's, but what about what happened to the, breach of modesty and this and that? So there's something to, again, the Kala's face is, again, there's something, it transcends the physical. It's like the soul is coming out already. So Rivka covers up. We don't hold that way, halacha. We don't trust our men well enough. So we are more strict, and we tell even to a bride, men should not stare at the bride for modesty reasons. But anyways, the bride does cover up, some less, some more. But the point is, there's such an idea in the halacha, because the bride, the Moshe, there's such an outpouring of the soul that it no longer, because everything's reversed now that needs to be covered, because it's too much. But the regular existence, we can look at our face and see that's a human being. It's not overpowering human, but it's a human. And we cover everything else so that we don't get misled into thinking that we're an animal, because that's what we look like from the neck down, even though that's not what we are. That's a big lie. Yeah. It was nighttime. Did she wear a veil as part of, because she was disguising herself? I don't know. It's certainly possible. The simple idea that she got away with masquerading as Rachel was that it was dark. So
cover her face?
Does it say she wraps her face? I have to look that up, but it would be in the context of approaching gauze, right? I mean,
Yeah.
It would, okay,
Shyness?
right.
Would it be shyness?
Yeah, it could be.
It could be shyness.
But I would say that the shyness is that's an expression of the true self coming out, and that's what it's overwhelming. So you tend to shy away. It's fascinating in Hebrew that the word for clothing is beged. Beged is clothing. Beged means treachery. Okay, you would see other places in the Torah that verb is used as treachery or rebellion. So why is clothes rebellion? Because when we see each other's clothing, we have to know that the whole purpose of clothing is the result of Adam and Eve's rebellion. In other words, clothing is a necessary evil because the ideal would have been the soul to come out. So all clothing are really an expression of a bad thing. Now it's necessary, but we shouldn't lose sight of the origin of clothing. And the verb to wear clothing in Hebrew is lavash, lamed beis shin. So lavash is the root of the word busha, or embarrassment. And what we're doing by wearing clothing is we are covering up our embarrassment, because there's nothing more embarrassing than the fact that we look like a human being and not a soul as a result of our sin. So we are lavash, we are covering our busha with our bigadim, which means to rebel, because all of clothing and all of dressing is all the result of Adam and Eve's transgression, because it changed the balance of body and soul. And that's all indicated by the story is bracketed by the two. Before the sin, they were naked and they weren't ashamed. And after the sin, all of a sudden, they were, all of a sudden, they realized they were naked. Okay, and then, of course, at the end of the story, God clothes them in totality to teach them the proper way to go. All right, so let's just introduce what we'll start and Emir Hashem continue next time. Let's go back now, because we had to jump ahead to have Hashem clothe everyone. Let's go back to verse 8 and introduce ourselves to the pitiful drop in spiritual level that Adam and Eve occurred. And what we'll get to next time is how this will lay the groundwork for the entire battle of good against evil throughout the generations. So it's trying to be an exciting coming attraction. But in verse 8, they hear the sound of Hashem God manifesting itself in the garden towards evening. Okay, what exactly that means is on their high level, they perceive God's presence approaching them. And the man and his wife hid from Hashem among the trees in the garden. Now, the commentators note the incredible contrast. Moments ago, Adam and Eve were conversing with God. Adam and Eve were striving to be like God. They were even willing to transgress God's will in order to be more like God. And now they are so distant that they can perceive a concept of hiding from God. And the commentators explain that this is based on the concept that God relates to us the way we relate to God. So if we want to search out God, God makes himself more apparent. And that's the paradigm for that is Abraham. Abraham is looking, where's God? I see the world has, order and purpose. Where's God? Where's God? They even have children's books now, where's God? And then God finally says, here I am, right? So you look for God, God searches for you. They say the same thing by Moshe when he sees the burning bush. Moshe goes to search out what's going on over here. So God says, oh, you're interested. So I'll introduce myself. And God introduces himself. Here, Adam and Eve are now pulling away from God. And God, therefore, is reflecting that to the point where they think there's actually a possibility to hide from God, which of course is an absurdity. But this becomes the mindset of the transgressor, that now that they've transgressed, they're looking to not come close to God, they're looking to hide from God. And it actually seems